You probably know the feeling. You vote and nothing changes. You vote again and still nothing. Rents keep rising, wages stay the same faces cycle through power. The promises are made, the elections pass, but nothing actually changes in any way that you can actually feel. That is a natural response to a system that has stopped being accountable for the people living in it. And right now, that feeling is the most politically powerful force on the planet. So here's the real question: is democracy disappearing? And if it is, what comes next? Because history has a very clear answer for that. Democracy at its core means one thing: power to the people. Not some of the people, ordinary people, real power over decisions that affect their lives. By that definition, you could say yes, it is disappearing. But maybe we never really had true democracy. Think about the last election in your country. Whoever won probably made a bunch of promises: lower bills, better hospitals, fixing the housing crisis. And they got into power and nothing really changed. And what happened to them? Nothing. They came back in the next election with a new set of promises. There is no rule that says that a politician has to do what he said he would do. You can't sue them, you can't remove them early. You just have to wait a few years and try again. And I think most people have figured this out and are just done with it. In Europe, the story is similar. Romania had its presidential election cancelled by its own courts in 2024. France's Macron bypassed the parliament entirely to push through a pension change that 70% of the country opposed. The EU had Ireland vote on the Lisbon Treaty. Ireland said no, democratically, clearly. And the EU's response was essentially try again. They made Ireland vote a second time until it produced the answer that Brussels wanted. Think about what that actually means. Your vote counts unless it's the wrong one. And nobody resigned over this, nobody was held accountable. It just happened and the world moved on. The EU makes decisions affecting hundreds of millions of people, and almost none of those people voted for these specific individuals who make these decisions. In America, it goes even further than that. Both parties, whenever they win control of a state, they get to redraw the lines that decide which voters are in which constituency. And they always redraw them to benefit themselves, of course. So imagine your neighborhood votes one way. The people in power can draw a line through your neighborhood that splits it in half and lumps each half with a bigger area that votes the other way. Your votes get swallowed up and your area never wins. It is completely legal and both sides do it. And the result is that in most of the country, the winner is decided before a single vote is cast. The election happens, but it doesn't maybe really mean anything. Different countries, different situations, but the same results. The people voted and it did not matter. That is not democracy. That is almost a costume that democracy wears. So if democracy is failing, what are people turning to? History shows repeatedly that when liberal democratic institutions fail to deliver material security and fairness, people begin looking elsewhere. The ideological alternatives that emerge from today's discontent span the political spectrum. But they do share a common feature: the rejection of the existing order, the claim of representing the people against the corrupt elite, and the promise of radical transformation. And technology has poured fuel on all of this. Algorithmic feeds have sorted the population into separate realities, making political consensus harder and tribal hostility easier. And crucially, online communities make it far easier than ever for different alternative ideologies to spread quickly, allowing discontented groups to organize, normalize, and discuss previously marginal ideas. So what are the most popular alternatives? Well, realistically, it's communism and fascism. And you might say, well, I'm exaggerating, but these are not fringe positions anymore. They are mainstream conversations. And to understand where they lead, we need to look at where they already have been. Across the US and Europe, socialist ideas are gaining real ground. Bernie Sanders, AOC, and Mamdani in the US, Mélenchon in France, Corbyn in the UK, all built massive movements around the idea that wealth should be distributed, that housing and healthcare are rights, and that corporations have too much power. For millions of people, especially young people who can't afford rent and are drowning in debt, this makes complete sense. The concern is what happens when governments actually try to force these ideas into reality. When the state takes control of industries, it tends to run them badly. Things get more expensive, quality drops, shortages appear, and once a government controls the economy, it has enormous power over ordinary people's lives. Russia in 1917 is the clearest example. Soldiers dying in a pointless war, peasants starving, and a czar that didn't care. The Bolsheviks promised peace, land, and bread. And early on, it kind of delivered. Land was redistributed, Russia got out of the war. For people at the bottom, it felt like genuine change. But then unions got under state control, strikes were banned, neighbors informed on neighbors, people were arrested on fabricated charges. The workers who were supposedly now in charge had less say about their conditions than before. A different group ended up at the top. Everyone else were pretty much in the same position. Every major attempt to build this sort of system starts with good intentions, but it ended in a small group having complete control and everyone else having no say. On the other side, you have parties like the AfD in Germany, the National Rally in France, Brothers of Italy, Republican Party in America. All of them have built massive followings around immigration and national identity. For people who feel like their culture is disappearing and people in power aren't listening, this is a genuinely compelling message. The concern is that this logic has a natural endpoint that history has already reached. When you build a movement around protecting one specific group of people, you naturally have to decide what to do with the rest of the people who don't fit. That decision has never ended well. Germany after World War I, its middle class wiped out by hyperinflation, their workers devastated by the depression. Italy fought the war and won, then got humiliated at the peace tables anyway. Both countries full of people who had done everything right and gotten destroyed regardless. Then Mussolini and Hitler rose to power. And again, early on, things seemed to improve. Unemployment fell, infrastructure got built, national pride came back. Millions thought, finally. But then unions got destroyed, press came under control, courts lost independence. The prosperity was borrowed against the future of war. And when that bill arrived, it arrived in full. Strongman leaders who promised to restore order always do it by dismantling the courts, the press, the institutions that could otherwise stop them. Once those things are gone, there is nothing to protect ordinary people. Despite their mutual hatred, communism and fascism follow the same structural logic. Both seized on legitimate and real suffering and offered complete solutions. Both dismantled the institutions that allowed citizens to correct the government's mistakes. Both required a permanent enemy to justify their control. And both ultimately failed the people that they claimed to serve the most. Without free unions, workers couldn't demand better wages. Without free press, bad policies couldn't be exposed. Without a real election, there was no way to really choose a different path. The deepest lesson of both experiences is not simply that these were cruel regimes. It is that they were structurally incapable of correcting themselves. The people who supported these movements were not uniquely foolish. They were desperate people who accepted their surrender of freedom in exchange for a promise of order and security. The sacrifice was real, but the salvation never came. So what's the actual alternative? Not communism, not fascism. History has answered that question with enough graves to fill continents. But also not this. Not a system where you vote every few years, watch how nothing happens, and then be told that you live in a democracy. Here's what I think might work. Not a pure direct democracy, that has its own problems. If you put every complex military and economic decision to a daily public vote, you would get manipulation at scale. Whoever would control the information would control the outcome. And we've already seen what social media does to people's ability to think clearly. Imagine that operating on every major policy decision simultaneously. But I don't think the answer to that is less democracy. I think it's better democracy. Binding referendums on major decisions, not ignorable, but actually binding. If 70% of people oppose a pension change, it doesn't happen. citizen assemblies with real power, not consultations that get filed away. Randomly selected ordinary people given proper information, deliberating seriously before parliament touches major decisions. Actual legal or some kind of consequences for broken promises, not just losing the next election in 4 years. Real consequences that make lying to voters an actual risk. And radical transparency about money. Most of what is broken in democracy right now flows through invisible funding. You fix the transparency and you cut off half the corruption automatically. Of course, easier said than done. But this isn't a fantasy. Versions of it exist. Switzerland has used direct democracy for a century, and mostly they've made reasonable decisions. Because when something actually affects your life, you tend to take it seriously. We don't need to tear down democracy, because the lesson of every failed revolution isn't that people can't be trusted with power. It's that when you take power away from people, someone far worse always moves in to fill the gap. And right now, they're already lining up.